You know, for centuries, if you wanted power, it meant controlling physical choke points, those narrow sea passages like the Bosphorus Strait, where a strong navy could literally starve a city into submission. But what if the most important choke points in the world aren't actually on a map? What if they exist inside the code and the currency that power our entire global system? Today, we're going to dig into how America figured out how to control these new gateways, and in doing so, unleashed a whole new age of economic warfare.
I mean, just think about that for a second. The contrast is absolutely staggering. Where the Spartans needed an entire fleet of warships, the United States now just needs a regulation, a PDF posted online. An entire nation's economic lifeline can be severed with the stroke of a key. This is a pretty scary, almost invisible kind of power. So we're going to break down how it was built, how it's being used, and what it all means for the future of how nations fight.
All right, so our story begins in what we're calling the Forge. But here's the thing. America's economic arsenal wasn't built from some grand strategy or a position of strength. Ironically, it was actually born from a period of total crisis and what felt like weakness back in the 1970s. And what's wild is just how fast all of this happened. In '71, the Nixon shock completely blows up the gold standard, and a lot of people thought American economic power was basically over. Then, just 2 years later, an oil embargo sends prices through the roof. It really looked like a total disaster. But out of all that chaos, Treasury Secretary William Simon pulls off a deal that, weirdly enough, would create a brand new kind of American dominance.
So this deal created what we now call the petrodollar system, and the logic behind it was beautifully simple. If you wanted to buy oil, and let's be real, every country on Earth needed oil, you now had to have US dollars to do it. That was a masterstroke. It created this permanent, massive global demand for American currency, and that put the dollar right at the absolute center of the world's financial system. This was the raw material from which the weapon would eventually be forged.
So for decades, this incredible power was just sitting there. It was latent. But in the 21st century, the United States started to consciously shape it into a weapon. The mission wasn't just about managing the economy anymore. It was about national security.
And the catalyst for that change was September 11th. All of a sudden, the fight against terrorism became a job for bankers and bureaucrats just as much as it was for soldiers. The U.S. Treasury created a whole new division, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, or TFI, with one single goal: follow the money and cut off the financial lifelines of America's enemies.
President Bush laid out the new reality in really stark terms. The message to the entire global financial system was simple. You have to choose. Access to the US dollar wasn't a right anymore, it was a privilege. And that privilege was now a weapon.
But this created a really interesting strategic puzzle. I mean, traditional sanctions are kind of useless against countries that are already cut off from the US economy, right? So how could the Treasury go after rogue states that were, well, already isolated? This was the big problem facing the first head of TFI, a guy named Stuart Levy.
And Levy's solution was just brilliant and kind of subtle. Instead of sanctioning a country like Iran directly, he went after the global banks that were still doing business with Iran. He didn't even need to use formal sanctions. He would just present them with a choice. Look, you can have access to Iran's small, risky market, or you can have access to the entire US dollar ecosystem. The choice was obvious. The reputational risk alone was so catastrophic that banks started to de-risk all on their own, cutting ties with Iran to protect themselves. The threat of being cut off became the weapon itself.
And that brings us right up to today, where this whole idea of banks versus tanks is very, very real. What started out as a tool to hunt terrorists is now one of the main weapons in the competition between major world powers.
I mean, just weeks before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, you had Russia and China declaring this no-limits partnership. It was a very clear challenge to the US-led world order, and it basically set the stage for a conflict where economic power was going to be just as decisive as military power.
And that's exactly what happened. As Russian tanks were rolling toward Kyiv, the West responded not just with missiles, but with an economic blitzkrieg of its own. Major Russian banks were unplugged from the global financial system. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Russia's foreign reserves, its war chest, were frozen, literally overnight. It was tanks versus banks, playing out in real time.
But the battlefield isn't just financial, it's also technological. In the competition with China, the US has deployed this obscure but incredibly powerful tool called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. The easiest way to think about it is this. It allows the US to block any company, anywhere in the world, from selling advanced chips to a target like Huawei, if those chips were made using even a single piece of American technology. It's a choke point on the entire global semiconductor supply chain.
And the impact? Well, it was immediate and undeniable. After this rule was put in place, Huawei's revenue just plummeted, dropping by over 20% from its peak. This wasn't just some dip in quarterly profits. It was hard proof that controlling a single technological choke point could seriously cripple a global corporate giant.
So you can imagine, this aggressive use of economic power has not gone unnoticed. The rest of the world is watching, and the result is this global scramble for economic security.
This question from Brazil's President Lula really captures this growing feeling around the world. Why should we remain so dependent on a system that can be turned into a weapon against us at any moment? From Brasilia to Beijing, leaders are now actively trying to find alternatives to the dollar.
The ultimate irony here is that the very effectiveness of these economic weapons is causing the world to fracture. We're now seeing what you could call a global scramble for economic security, where nations are trying to build their own financial and technological walls to insulate themselves from U.S. pressure. And that's a direct challenge to decades of globalization.
So, where does this all leave us? What are the future battlegrounds going to look like in this new era of economic war? Let's just quickly trace the path we've followed.
You can really see this golden thread connecting everything. It starts as an accidental empire, forged in the crises of the 70s. That power was then honed into a precision weapon after 9/11. Today, it's used in full-scale economic warfare between nations, which has now triggered this huge global backlash. Each stage just logically flows from the one before it. And this leaves us with some really critical questions. For decades, the big idea was that being economically interconnected, interdependent, made the world more peaceful. But now that those very connections can be turned into weapons, how are countries supposed to balance the promise of global trade against the fundamental need for national security?
And then, of course, there's the big one. What about the dollar itself? As the scramble for alternatives gets more serious, could new technologies like digital currencies or new economic blocks like the BRICS finally create a world that isn't so centered on the United States?
And finally, as technology just keeps accelerating, the nature of power is evolving right along with it. The dollar was the key choke point of the 20th century. Semiconductors are a key choke point today. So what's next? In a world that's going to be powered by AI and quantum computing, will the next critical choke point be control over data? Over algorithms? Or maybe over the very foundation of digital intelligence itself? And who's going to be the one to control it?